Hello. I very much hope that this paper finds you and your family as well and as safe as possible during these difficult and very strange times. At the outset of this paper, I'd like to offer a warning as to some of the content, which some listeners may find traumatic or upsetting. There will be a brief discussion of sexual assault and also of racial discrimination. This paper hovers around some similar material that I explored in an article published a few years ago, so I'm greatly indebted to Caroline McGuinness for the chance to update it, drawing on material that wasn't available when I was writing. And for this talk, I decided to go back and return to some earlier material that didn't make it into the article because I didn't want to simply just repeat myself for you today. I'd like to think and talk a little about Lucy Caldwell's investment in and depictions of girls, in particular Girlhood Desire, in her 2016 collection, Multitudes. Caldwell is a writer fiercely attuned to the ongoing inequality that affects the lives of girls, women, people of colour, and the LGBTQ population. She is a writer keen to tell stories that are often sidelined. Caldwell's desire to focus on marginalised voices is part of her commitment to what the Italian writer Elena Ferrante has labelled the revolutionary act of writing about her own lived experience as a woman. In a discussion in Greta Gerwig's recent adaptation of Louisa May Alcott's novel Little Women, two sisters, Jo and Beth, discuss the literary value of women's lives. They argue about whether writing literature about something gives it value. Jo believes the novel that she is writing will be boring and ultimately insignificant because it is about young women, domestic life, and the everyday routines in the private world of the home. Her younger sister Amy passionately disagrees, insisting that writing about something confers value upon it. Jo's novels will make these stories literature through their telling, and that these are stories that need to be told. For Alcott, Gerwig, Ferrante, and Caldwell, there is something radical in telling stories about women's lives. But there is also something else that unites Alcott, Gerwig, Ferrante, and Caldwell. From Little Women to Gerwig's first film, Lady Bird, the earlier novels in Ferrante's Neapolitan series to Caldwell's fictions. In all, the unique intensities of girls and girlhood loom large. Because today I really want to talk about the radically subversive power of girls and the symbolic resonance of girlhood. This is illustrated brilliantly in Lisa McGee's Derry Girls, which, for those of you unfamiliar with the Channel 4 television show, is a comedy drama about 4 teenage girls and a token boy growing up in Derry during the Troubles. I really wanted to get a picture of just the 4 girls without the wee English fella, as he's known, but I couldn't get an image of high enough quality. So we see these girls behaving in ways we don't always expect or often allow. They're noisy, they're rebellious, and they're horny. The 4 Derry girls take up space. They own and explore their burgeoning sexual identities and sexual agency in a way we can see in Caldwell's fiction too. These girls are what Sarah Ahmed has termed willful subjects, which is something that I wrote about in greater detail in my article, and Fiona McCann has also written about brilliantly in a recent article on women prisoners for the Irish University Review. Because there is something acutely resonant about this turn to girlhood in an Irish, and significantly, a Northern Irish context. Like much of Caldwell's fiction, many of the short stories in Multitudes are marked by the imprint of Northern Ireland's social and religious conservatism, a conservatism that disproportionately affects women, people of colour, and the LGBTQ plus population. In Multitudes, Caldwell returns to Northern Ireland in the 1980s and early to mid-1990s. And in making a conscious decision not to focus directly on Troubles-related violence, Caldwell's work can be read as offering a subversive, feminist critique of the dominant narratives repeated about the North. Caldwell suggests here, in this quotation, that it could seem that, quote, only certain stories are worthy of being told. The big stories, the stories that suck up all of the oxygen, about the bombs you'd seen, the bereavement you'd suffered. But, Caldwell insists, there are plenty of stories that have not yet been told, and that these are, quote, just as important as the big stories. And wanting to write, Caldwell articulates about, quote, sisters, about the intense friendships girls have in their teens, stories of children questioning their gender, of two girls falling in love. Caldwell privileges the small stories. Caldwell's focus in fiction echoes the critical attention that scholars such as Caroline McGuinness, Ellie Davies, and Adam Hanna have given to the political importance of the domestic space of the home and the realms of intimacy. Just as Caroline McGuinness argued in her recent paper for the British Association of Irish Studies online conference, she speaks vitally about the importance of developing a criticism that moves beyond a particular citational force field, and a particularly masculine one at that. I'm interested in how Caldwell's move towards telling the small stories of girlhood becomes an act of subversion. Writing about the lived realities of girlhood also frees them from the heavy representative burden that has often accompanied women and girls in Irish and Northern Irish culture. Associating Ireland with the feminine is a ubiquitous trope in the two discourses running parallel in English imperialism and Irish nationalism. This has been so often fleshed out in academic work that I'll not rehearse that for you here. That said, Steffi Lehner has written insightfully about the peace process, Good Friday Agreement, and the representational role that heteronormative family and all the gendered roles that implies have played as a metonym for the Northern Irish nation. However, I'm a critic, and if I wasn't looking for patterns of symbolism and meaning, I'd be out of a job, so I can't resist turning again to the cover image of the Good Friday Agreement. Because there's an especially pleasing detail. While the two parents seem preoccupied with their younger child, on the right-hand side here, who we can assume, if you'll indulge my rather heteronormative gendering of their silhouettes based on hair length, is their youngest son. But their daughter, on the left-hand side, who's been somewhat ignored, stares resolutely into the non-existent western coastline of Northern Ireland, watching its sunset. With the imperative, this agreement is about your future, emblazoned underneath the image of the girl, I'd like to take this as a point of departure for a discussion about the relationship between girlhood and futurity. Girlhood is a state with striking biopolitical potential. Girls physically and metaphorically embody the future because of their vital role in reproduction. In this way, girlhood animates discussion, and perhaps uncertainty, about the future in a more obvious fashion than boyhood. The nature of girlhood is profoundly troublesome, as both a slippery semantic concept and a peculiarly anxiety-inducing moment in human development. Girlhood is a term that is hard to define, and in her landmark study on the subject, Catherine Driscoll actively avoids defining the term concretely. While Driscoll ties girlhood to, quote, feminine adolescence, end quote, she is keen to assert that feminine adolescence is not the same as, quote, female adolescence. Female adolescence, Driscoll advises, is, quote, predominantly a discourse of puberty, end quote, and the physical changes that mark the transition from girl child to adult woman. The social, cultural, and psychological markers of girlhood are not necessarily attached to the bodily changes of puberty. Rather, girlhood can be understood as the transitional stage of a girl becoming a woman, and it is precisely the indeterminate nature of this stage that gives the girl her own particular type of agency. The in-between quality of the girl on the borders of childhood and adulthood makes the voice especially effective for Northern Irish literature, for Northern Ireland has a particularly liminal role to play within the British Isles. Eamon Hughes has argued that, quote, Northern Ireland is not so much enclosed by its borders as defined by them. It is a border country, end quote. Adolescence is the physical embodiment of this borderline identity. The girl is a liminal figure, no longer a child, not quite an adult, and it occupies a particular temporal crux, both straddling the past and gesturing towards the future. But even while teenage bodies, particularly female, are uncomfortably liminal, their adolescence also signifies futurity. Susan Cahill writes, Girlhood, as a category between the more manageable spaces of childhood and married womanhood, tends to embody society's anxieties about uncontrollable futures. This is not lost on Caldwell, and Multitudes is explicitly concerned with what is yet to come. Multiple stories, such as Through the Wardrobe, about a trans girl, end with their characters willfully asserting control over their futures, declaring, quote, no matter what it takes, and no matter how long it takes, you will come through. Other stories of adolescence, like Poison and Here We Are, conclude with the first-person narrator as an adult, anxiously drawing attention to youthful hopes for a different future, or frustrated desires that are at odds with the North's repressive culture. Written from the perspective of girlhood and giving full expression to subversive desires, these stories capitalise on the liminality of youth. The embodied futurity of the girl enables Caldwell to imagine how different the future might look and how this girl can renegotiate her role within and beyond the limits and constraints of a conservative Northern Ireland. There is, however, something ambiguous and ambivalent about girlhood. There are various stories in Multitudes, especially those dealing with girls in the early adolescent years of 12, 13 and 14, like 13, Poison and Killing Time, that explicitly dwell on this space between childhood and adulthood in knowing, subversive and often uncomfortable ways. In 13, narrated like so many of Caldwell's stories by an unnamed girl who turns 13 within the first few pages of the story, Caldwell consistently draws our attention to this in-between, to the in-between nature of girlhood and its ability to unsettle expected standards. Over the course of the story, the narrator partakes in several adult behaviours. On 2 separate occasions, she is coerced into several unwanted sexual acts, some of which take place when she is drunk. It is significant, however, that Caldwell's prose filters these, quote, adult experiences through language that is deliberately evocative of childhood. The narrator recounts her first sips of alcohol as tasting a bit like the red marshmallow penny sweets from the very bottom of the tub in the newsagents. Its effects, too, are described in almost saccharine terms, and the narrator states, I can feel the glow of it already, sweet and fuzzy and tingling, spreading from my stomach and inside my limbs. Such description heightens our sense of the innocence and youth of the narrator, alerting us to the precarious nature of girlhood. To intensify this unnerving dialogue between childhood and adulthood, and the awkward place that our narrator occupies within it, Caldwell locates his alcohol consumption and later sexual assault in the children's playground in Cairnburn Park, East Belfast. When the narrator realises she is drunk, she, quote, leans against the wooden frame of the kiddie castle and tries to concentrate on breathing. She later finds her school friend, Jacqueline Dunn, quote, by the slide, kissing another teenage boy. So while the girl can symbolise a hopeful futurity, and we might want to read Caldwell's Girls as embodying a vision for a different future Northern Ireland, this engagement with 13 tells us that Multitudes is doing something else too. Caldwell is alert to the specific dangers, boredoms, and, of course, joys inherent in being a teenage girl. In writing, as she emphasised, she wanted to do truthfully and unsentimentally about the lives of girls, Caldwell must confront the everyday difficulties and aggressions of growing up in a white man's world, even without dealing with a violent conflict and its legacies. This focus on the narrator's youth in 13 has a twofold effect. In Caldwell's troubling description of the narrator's dalliance with some aspects of adulthood, she highlights how vulnerable girls are and the tangible, persistent threats that they face. But 13 also illustrates the tenacity of such young people and their willful abilities to imagine more convivial futures. Despite the harrowing, unwanted sexual encounters that the narrator endures throughout the story, which Caldwell confronts with precise honesty, in an act of mental resilience towards the story's end, our narrator returns to a memory of a pleasurable encounter driven by desire, And the story concludes with the narrator telling herself that, quote, morning will come, end quote. This hopeful energy for a more optimistic and tolerant future is made especially palpable when it becomes clear that our narrator's primary platonic and romantic relationships are with two siblings, Susan and Michael, who have been born to a white mother and black father. It also feels especially important at our current moment to highlight that this family of colour are hounded out of Belfast by racist bullying and intimidation. The violence of the story's coerced sexual activity and racial prejudice is offset against a moment of intimacy with Susan's brother, Michael. The memory of a kiss driven by desire, respect, and mutual attraction. Whether forced encounters with other boys are clinical, obtrusive, and unpleasant, quote, wet and spitty, or with so much tongue, or so hard she almost gags, with Michael, the kiss is perfect. Caldwell's description of the scene depicts the gentle sensuality of the relationship between the two teenagers and the playful tenderness of their interactions that culminate in the kiss. Our narrator says that her tummy flips, and afterwards her wrist, her whole arm seem to be tingling where he has touched her. When Michael leans forward and kisses her, the narrator delights in the haptic pleasure. The kiss is perfect, a long, slow pull of a kiss. Carolyn McGannis has written particularly well about how brilliant Caldwell is on desire, but also I think what's particularly brilliant about Caldwell's fiction is how seriously she takes the desire of girls and young people, something which is often dismissed or manipulated. There's a woeful energy to Caldwell's girls then, even in the face of trauma and difficulty, but there is also a real, unflinching recognition of the level of aggression, macro and micro, that the North's marginalised communities face. 13 documents not just the sexual intimidation that our narrator is exposed to, but the racism that her friends of colour suffer. There is a myth that racism is not a problem in Ireland or Northern Ireland, and this is simply not true. The Belfast photographer Vanessa Ifidora recently published an Instagram post tackling this matter directly. Writing of her childhood in Northern Ireland, she states, racism in Northern Ireland was brutal. It continues to be brutal. Statistics from the 2017 Northern Ireland Life and Times survey, co-managed by researchers from both Queen's University Belfast and Ulster University, reveal that 52% of people surveyed would not accept a Muslim into their family by marriage. When it came to accepting an Irish traveller by marriage, the statistic was even higher, at 56% indicating that they would not be happy about this. Caldwell highlights how the violence of prejudice and discrimination mark people's lives, even as she doesn't attempt to speak on behalf of or claim an experience she has not lived through. The short story form is, perhaps, a particularly apposite literary form for both the articulation of certain types of experience, so long sidelined and marginalised, and of a form of resistance to dominant narratives, literary and otherwise. Again, I don't want to dwell too much on this, but a glance at some critical work reveals that the short story has often been positioned as a means of expressing post-colonial writing back, which is complicated in the North, of course, or what Deleuze and Guattari term minor literature. In his seminal and often quoted study of the short story The Lonely Voice, Frank O'Connor suggests that the short story is particularly well suited to writing about what he labels, quote, submerged population groups, or figures wandering about the fringes of society, marginalised from a dominant social tradition. Some critics, most notably Claire Hansen, suggest that these marginalised figures include women and people of colour, amongst others, and elucidates further on the enabling properties of the form, noting how, quote, the formal properties of the short story, disjunction, inconclusiveness, this word is difficult, being oblique, connect with its ideological marginality, and with the fact that the form may be used to express something suppressed or repressed in mainstream literature. The ability of short fiction to express something repressed is particularly pertinent to our discussion of the politics of Caldwell's stories. So in both their form and content, Caldwell's stories about girls are disruptive. Even as Caldwell articulates the radical possibilities of girlhood desire as subversive and transgressive that might have the potential to remake future communities and galvanise a change in our ethical and moral commitments, her forensic focus on the truthful and unsentimental lived realities of being a young woman is testament to the unique challenges that girls endure. And the stories of girls, as I briefly touched upon, are just one of the often sidelined groups that Caldwell's fiction tends to focus on. Caldwell's girls suggest that our future might be a more hopeful one, but they occupy a complex, knotty, uncomfortable, ambivalent space where they are brave but vulnerable. Turning once more to the final lines of Caldwell's story, 13 powerfully exemplifies this. In a defiant stance against the trauma that the story contains, the last words of Caldwell's narrator ring out as she wills the events into the past. One day, all of this will be long ago, as if it happened in another place, another time, and maybe I won't ever think about it anymore, and even if I do, it'll already be over.